Okay, welcome back. The next part is going to feature the conversations/messages portion of messaging within an app. Out of the box, these conversations won't necessarily relate to the trade itself, but there is a whole separate conversations area that's going to be part of the app, and that's the concept that I'm going with. Initially, I wanted to kind of house it all within the trade itself, but I think that's a little too cumbersome, and it would have end up being about 3 nested routes, which would have been crazy to do, and kind of a bad pattern of practice to go that far in terms of nesting. So what we're going to do is just create that conversations concept, and it's a little involved, a little kind of tricky to get up off the ground, but I think we can roll with it. Some of it might feel dirty in terms of the controllers and stuff, and that's okay for me because I'm just trying to get the concept out. Obviously there could be enhancements later. So to start, I'm going to, instead of scaffolding stuff, I'm going to create this stuff willy-nilly, so it's going to be more or less from scratch. So first we're going to create the conversations migration and adjust the table to basically do what we want to once we run the actual Rails DB migrate key commands. So I'm going to create an actual migration at this point called create conversations. And you won't pass anything here. I'm just going to add it ourselves. So it should create a migration in your DB folder. I'll go to that one. And it should be the latest one. We have a table that was created. And inside that, I want to have a t.integer. And it's going to be sender ID. And t.integer recipient ID. And then we could just have our timestamps that come by default there. Okay, so with that one done, we can just do our DB migrate. And I should probably say what those actually do. So the concept behind these is that for the user, we're going to be able to target the user based on if they're the sender or the recipient based on a condition on an index that we're going to create on the messages migration coming up. So that's actually the very next thing we'll do. So I'm going to create a new migration called Rails generate migration, create messages. We'll do the same thing. Edit this one to include, let's see, T for text is going to be body, and T.references. So this is going to reference the conversation model. And it's singular there, and then we're going to have an index column on it, and we'll do the same for users. And then from there we can just add the timestamps. Now an enhancement you could add later that I'm probably not going to focus on is adding just some sort of like Boolean flag to mark it as red or show it as red, and you could set like a default here of false, something like that, and then from there you can just always toggle that based on if a new message comes through. That's over the scope of this, so I'm just kind of getting the wheels running here. What I want to do from here is migrate that and make sure we have it spelled right, conversation. There we go, and we got our indexes, our user index, true, great. References, body, awesome. So with that done, I'll do Rails DB migrate again. Okay, so those should be in our schema now. If you want to visually see this stuff on the messages was created here, we've got those indexes, and then the conversations here as well. So cool. With that done, we can begin creating our controllers. And you can either create this by hand or just run a fancy way to run this without creating a bunch of stuff is model conversation. You can skip the migration since we just created it by hand. So that's a way to do it. That creates tests and other things if you use that. So we'll go into that model conversation. There we go. So this is going to have quite a few things going on that's going to make it probably hard to understand, but I think once you work with the app a little more and get it built and just kind of pick through it, it'll make more sense. So initially it's going to belong to a sender, and we got that from the ID we've passed. So you can call this what you want at this point. We're going to have a foreign key which is based on that ID we created. So foreign key, and then we'll pass in what we actually created, so sender ID. And then we need to define it as a class name user. So this allows a model like this to talk to the user model in such a way and figure out things that it wouldn't normally be able to do through a primary foreign key. Foreign key is recipient ID. Same with the class name of user. Cool. So conversations, of course, are going to have many messages. Validate uniqueness of sender ID, this recipient making the message to the recipient. And then below that, I made a comment. I'll start with that. So it's this scope. And a scope is a way you can kind of query the database in a more nice fashion. So instead of this long string we're about to type, we can just call between in our controller, and it'll do the magic of finding this stuff based on our model. So right now this isn't really being scoped anywhere. We'll have to actually access our controller to deal with it. So that's good and great. So we can do the same for our message model in terms of generating it. So I'll do Rails generate model message and then skip the migration. And we'll go and edit our model, message model. So our message model will feature, belongs to quite a few things. Conversations. Belongs to user. And then we'll want to do validates. So this is another way to write, like validates presence. True. I've written that in the past. It's a different way. This is kind of an older way, I would say. So use whatever you're comfortable with there. We will be accessing a helper from in this model. I'm just going to put it here. That we'll get from the review or views. But it's basically just creating a nice time format. So created at string format to time. That's just a nice way to say the message was recorded at this time. So we'll get into how that looks when we get to the views. All right, so with that done, we can go to the controller side of it now and modify those. You can generate a controller. We only need a few things within the conversations one, so I'm going to create that one from scratch. Before action, we'll authenticate. A user should always be logged in at this point, so we don't have to say accept or anything like that. If I can spell before action, and then on our index route, our action, we'll get all the users and just say user.all. Oops. And conversations, so we can display them all. Cool. And on a creating an actual conversation is where the between scope is going to come into play. It's going to grab those two users based on the person browsing and the person who authored the trade and create a new message bucket that's called a conversation. So if conversation dot between, there's that scope, and then we'll pass in the parameters of the conversation. So we can say params sender ID and params recipient ID, and we're just checking if they're present. So you just say present, and then we'll do else and another in. So in between here, if it is present, we'll do conversations, or just conversation, and then grab this query between params, basically the same thing we just typed. So params sender ID and params recipient ID, and we'll get the first conversation. Else, just say conversation is going to equal this. We're going to actually create it. And you can create it inline just by throwing a bang after the create method there, and then pass in the conversation params. So basically, if there's already a conversation going on, that's what this is going to do. It's going to find it. Else, it's going to create a new one. So after that, we will redirect to conversation messages path. And we haven't set up a routes to match this URL yet, so this certainly won't work if you fired up your server and checked. So I'll still need to do that, but we'll get to it. And we can just pass in the conversation there. And below that, we need to get our params set up. So private method here, and we'll have it called conversation params. And that's being called right here, if you're curious. So in that, we'll just get params.permit. This is strong params and Rails. And we'll permit those IDs. I need to get a colon in front of that one. There we go. So this allows Rails to let us create this inline like this by permitting them initially. And our messages controller we'll do next. And this one's going to be kind of intense compared to the others. So I'll do messages. And I'm just creating this by hand just because it's a little more lean in terms of scaffolding all the views we probably won't use. So make sure you change the name here, messages. It's always plural. A controller is always plural. A model is always singular. All right, so here we want to set a before action to authenticate as well. Pretty much on all these controllers. I cannot type action. Actually, no, we don't. We can just, by the time they're in a conversation, they'll already be authenticated. So a message is redundant. So I'll say find conversation, and we want to grab the messages within the conversation itself. So we can get conversation, which we still need to create down at the bottom. So I'll do messages. Why don't I create that now so it makes more sense? So private def message params, we're going to need this one. I'll do the fun conversation first. So here we can look for conversation based on the conversation parameter, the ID parameter. So it'll look like so that'll be coming through the URL when we enter the conversation. And from that, we can grab it and get its messages. So that's what we're doing here. So within that, we can do an if statement. This is kind of a UX helper, just a way to present a load more kind of state if the messages get really long, which is nice. Okay. Then we have our create and new actions. So create's going to be pretty simple, or new is going to be pretty simple. It's going to be that same bit. And then create's going to be a little more intense. So we'll say at message equals conversation dot message is dot new. Pass in message params, which we still need to create. And then if it saves, we'll redirect to conversation messages path and pass in the conversation again. And in that block, so we need to create the message parameters now. In that block, and within that we can do a params.require. This is basic Rails strong parameter stuff. So message, and then we could permit the body, which is a column we were using for the message. We can permit the user ID, which we need to access, and then that should be it, I believe. That should do it. We need to set up our routes still, and that's something that's going to really error out if we don't. So like stuff like this, conversation messages, that gives you the clue that there is a nested route involved. Otherwise it would just say like conversations path or messages path, and it'll go deeper and deeper the further you go deeper in your routes. So it's been at least advised among the community never to nest more than 3 levels deep in Rails. So I would just kind of abide by that. It's just nicer to look at and easier to control in the end. So I think I would just stand by doing that. So let's go to our routes and update it real quick. So we're going to have resources trades on its own, and then we'll have resources conversations do in the new block, and then resources messages. Cool. So for good measure, you might quit your server and restart it. Control C, and then I just hit up and hit Rails S. And then we should be able to see the messages and everything going on now, which I need to add that string into the mix there. Let's go back to our views, show. Down here on conversations, I need to update that to say conversations path. And this will become quite a long URL, but we're passing in essentially the sender ID and the recipient ID at this point. So sender ID, and we'll close that parenthesis. We need a method of post here, so it hits that create action. And then we'll keep that class as is. So if you're not understanding with the method side of it, a nice way to at least debug it is to go to localhost 3000. This is kind of a inner hack, Rails info routes. And you'll see all the list of routes here. You can type in to search specific routes, but there are create actions. We just don't, or new actions, we just don't make use of them so much, depending on what kind of post or get processing you do. So post in essence is going to the create action at that point. So that's kind of where that's coming from. But there's all these RESTful routes built into Rails that end up giving you access to things just by saying method this, method that, etc. So if all is well, go back to this app. I should be able to visit my conversations. Got a typo. Yep, let's see. Yeah, conversations model. Hopefully you were screaming at me when I typed that. Maybe not. And it looks like I have no template for the controller conversations index. So that's a good, at least a good error to get, because that confirms that it's it's going to that path. So our views are inexistent. We need to create those. So I'm going to go conversations and just create a new directory and then an index file. And this correlates to our conversations controller index path here. So let's go and update that. Again, we're getting this from our index action that we established here. So we have our users and our conversations. Pass an instance variable, so conversation. Probably could make that smaller, but it makes more sense to use the real thing. And if here, it kind of gets a little logic mess going on in the code, but it's okay. So if conversation sender ID is equal to the current user ID, or conversation recipient ID is equal to the current user ID. So if you are involved in this conversation, that's what this is doing, then do something. So then if we can call a specific person, so if conversation dot sender ID is equal to current user ID, we want to set a variable within the code to be, and we could put this in the controller too. I don't know why I chose to put it in the view, but we'll do user.find conversation dot recipient ID, else recipient equals user.find conversation dot sender ID. So this is a bunch to put in a view, so you might consider abstracting it out. I'm gonna leave it alone for now for the sake of time. But here we're gonna say unless the current user is equal to recipient ID, I want to display this stuff. So recipient ID so if all goes right, we should be able to see users. This needs to be plural. Cool. So we don't have any conversations yet, but this at least is looking right. And cool. So at this point, you need another user to even have a conversation. So let me create that, and then in the next video, we'll get into the actual message look and feel. I can go to this trade. Now I can message Andy because I authored it, but that's another account. And it should go to our conversations. Looks like we don't have sender ID. Oh, I need to type my stuff right. Let's see, conversations. Where's that at? Controller is wrong. I think it's on way back in our model at this point. Yep, conversations. Cool. All right, so let's back out, refresh, create, initialize. All right, guys, let me double check my work here and come back to you. It looks like stuff's passing through, but we're still kind of getting a null ID itself on the conversation. So I'll figure that out, and then the next video we'll start to work on the messages portion and just get things squared out. So I'll see you then.